After the end of the world. Again. This is Blackbird Rook, writing about contemporary art and the culture around it. I was in my final year at Goldsmiths when 9/11 happened. It was the beginning of a new academic year, that last stretch toward whatever artistic endgame you think you're heading for, and the towers fell. We were deep in critical theory, in lectures about representation and systems and ideology, and suddenly the world outside those frameworks ruptured in real time. It was not that the theory became irrelevant overnight. It was that it suddenly felt smaller, secondary, like footnotes to a reality that had become more spectacular, more horrifying and more symbolically charged than anything we were discussing in the seminar room. And I remember very clearly that what followed was not just grief, but a collapse of confidence in art's significance, not a crisis of medium, not a crisis of form, but a crisis of purpose. Making art began to feel faintly ridiculous, inadequate to the scale of what had happened, trivial even, like trying to write poetry in the middle of a literally collapsing building. And for a while, a lot of us paused. That feeling stayed with me for years. It was not only the horror of 9/11. It was the scale of its image and symbolism, the way it overwhelmed the cultural imagination. Every attempt at representation felt futile, or worse, presumptuous. The usual art school mix of ambition and irony simply evaporated. In its place was a blunt question. What the hell can art do in the face of this? For a long time, that question had real force. I came back to it years later when making a series titled, "And This Too Shall Pass Away." Those paintings were full of eschatological echoes, not biblical in any straightforward sense, but shaped by the 20th century's own visions of catastrophe, death camps, atrocity, ruin, the sense that history had already shown us the edge of the abyss. At the time, I was asking myself what art might look like after collapse. Not how it redeems anything, because it doesn't. Not how it solves anything, because it can't. But how it might register something truthfully. How it might bear witness to the atmosphere of living after catastrophe, or in its shadow. And that brings me to now. Because if you look around at the present moment, it is not as though horror has receded. Quite the opposite. It has multiplied. Gaza, Ukraine, Iran, climate breakdown, political fracture, America splitting open along old fault lines, the slow corrosion of public language by algorithms, propaganda, and permanent distraction. You might think that under those conditions, we would once again be asking that same question with some urgency. What is the point of making art now? But the striking thing is that we do not seem to be asking it, not in the same way, not with the same seriousness, not with the same collective uncertainty about whether art still has any purchase on the wider world. That absence worries me. It is not that artists are not responding. They are. There is politically engaged work being made. There are artists thinking deeply and seriously about violence, memory, power, and grief. But the broader crisis of meaning, the larger doubt about art's relevance, the doubt that seemed unavoidable after 9/11, does not feel present in the same way now. Why is that? Has art stopped being expected to engage with public life? Or have we simply become so accustomed to crisis that even the question now feels worn out? Part of me wonders whether the answer is that art is no longer under pressure to justify itself because almost nobody outside the art world expects very much from it anymore. Back in 2001, it still felt as though art might ripple outward, that what happened in galleries and institutions could enter public discourse, that a biennale, a performance, an installation, even an argument in Art Forum might connect with broader questions of politics and culture. It still seemed possible for artists to be cultural protagonists rather than specialists talking to one another in a sealed room. Now, art is, in one sense, more visible than ever. There are more fairs, more openings, more images, more programs, more content, more visibility everywhere. And yet it somehow feels more marginal. Gallery openings still fill up. MFA programs continue to churn out graduates. The machinery of the art world carries on very efficiently. But there is much less sense that what happens within it interrupts public discourse, reframes it, or gets beyond its own professional circuits. We produce, promote, and post. But who exactly is listening? Part of the problem is that the old infrastructure that once gave art some wider cultural charge has weakened badly. Critics who once connected practice to public life have been replaced, or at least outnumbered, by influencers and market-adjacent commentators. The magazines that used to mediate between art, politics, and the general reader have either disappeared or retreated into specialist language. Even institutions, which once liked to imagine themselves as places of conscience and debate, often seem constrained by funding pressures, risk aversion, and managerial caution. And what fills that vacuum is something like aesthetic neoliberalism. By that I mean an art world that behaves more and more like an unregulated market, free from collective expectations, free from any shared sense that art should help us think, judge, or make sense of the world. Art survives, certainly. It thrives economically in some corners. It remains beautiful, expensive, and technically sophisticated. But its public role has thinned. We no longer look to art to intervene. At best, we ask it to reflect. At worst, we ask it to decorate. And that feels like a serious downgrade in expectation. Maybe there is another way of putting it. Perhaps the art world has, in practice, already answered the question of what art is for, and the answer is the market. In the absence of political consensus, moral seriousness, or any broader cultural faith in art's civic role, we default to what sells. Meaning is replaced by metrics. The artwork becomes an asset. The studio becomes a startup. The fair replaces the forum. That is a caricature, obviously. But caricatures are useful because they sharpen tendencies that polite language often hides. The deeper worry is not simply that we have stopped asking what art can do, it is that we have stopped expecting anything from it at all. And in that vacuum, what has taken the place of collective reckoning is not public thought or shared cultural urgency, but content. An endless stream of circulating images, a feed, a fair, a spectacle of visibility detached from consequence. This is not only about commerce, though commerce is part of it. It is also about the collapse of the intellectual and moral infrastructure that once allowed certain works to exceed the boundaries of the art world and become provocations in the culture at large. A Schneemann, a Hake. Even when people disliked the work, they knew it was addressing something beyond itself. It entered public argument. Now even political art often circulates only among those already predisposed to receive it. The work exists. The statement exists, the exhibition exists, but the signal rarely breaks the algorithmic wall. It does not travel far enough to become socially disruptive. So perhaps the issue is not that artists are failing to respond. Perhaps it is that the conditions that once allowed art to matter publicly have changed beyond recognition. We no longer gather around works of art in the same way. There is no shared pause, no wider rupture, no real reckoning. And maybe that is because crisis itself has changed. It no longer arrives as an interruption to ordinary life. It is the medium through which ordinary life is now lived. Catastrophe has become ambient. War, terror, pandemic, democratic decline, ecological dread. None of these fully stop the machine anymore. They become part of the backdrop, absorbed into the ongoing churn of information and exhaustion. And when catastrophe becomes ambient, the metabolism of moral response slows down. What once might have produced a genuine rupture in culture now barely makes a dent before the next thing arrives. So the question may not be, why is art not responding? The better question may be whether the wider system, the one that once allowed art to shape conversation, imagination, or public feeling, has simply moved on. Meaning-making happens elsewhere now. In memes, live streams, leaks, footage, fragments, clips, slogans, pile-ons. The cultural agora is no longer the gallery. It is the platform. And art, in its older form, slow, difficult, demanding, durational, struggles in that environment. Not because it has failed, but because attention itself has changed, and what that leaves us with is a reduced register. Artists still make, viewers still look, collectors still buy, institutions still program, but the whole thing often unfolds without interruption, without consequence, without that older sense that art might arrest us, trouble us, or force a broader public reckoning. That may sound pessimistic. Perhaps it is, but I do think it is worth asking. What happens when art outlives its urgency? What happens when it survives every catastrophe, but only by becoming less expected, less consequential, and less able to cut into public life? I do not think art is dead. I do not think it is useless. And I certainly do not think artists should stop making it. But I do think we have to be honest about the distance that has opened up between art and the wider culture, and about the lowered expectations that now surround the whole enterprise. Maybe the question after the end of the world is not whether art can save us. It never could. Maybe the question is whether we still believe art should do anything more than circulate. And if we do still believe that, then the next question is harder. What would have to change for art to feel urgent again? Thank you for watching. If you want more essays like this one, you can find the newsletter at Blackbird Rook on Substack and follow on Instagram at @BlackbirdRook.